Here's a fun fact about woodworking. To do this hobby, you need tools.
Yes! Genius.
I know, right? But there's good news. Some of these tools you don't actually have to buy. There are things you can build yourself that in some cases can delay or even eliminate expensive tool purchases down the road. We call these things jigs, and here's my list of the jigs I think you need to make right now. So if you've watched my channel before, you probably know I rely heavily on my track saw, especially when cutting sheet goods. It has very good dust collection and utilizes a track like this one to make perfectly straight cuts. And honestly, I consider this to be a buy as soon as you can kind of tool, but I understand a lot of woodworkers just don't have the budget for it, and so here's a quick and easy way to avoid that purchase. This jig will actually take a circular saw and turn it into a passable track saw and save you hundreds of dollars in the process. The first thing to do is cut a strip of 1/2-inch plywood. How wide you cut this strip could vary, and I'll explain why in a minute, but the length can really be anything you want. I recommend making this jig at least 5 feet long, and that way you have enough runway to cut a full sheet of plywood in half. Okay, once you have that first cut, you're gonna make a second cut, and this one is gonna be narrower, but it's gonna be the exact same length. I find about 3 inches wide is pretty good for this one, but this too could vary based on your saw. And the key when cutting this strip is that one of the two edges needs to be as dead straight as you can possibly get it, so use whatever method is at your disposal to make that happen. A table saw is a great idea for making that cut, or like I'm doing here, I just stuck a straight edge down to my plywood using 2-sided tape and made the cut. And now that we have our strips, here's how to build the jig. I'm going to attach the smaller strip to the larger one, but first I need to know how much room I need to leave on this side of the jig. And the measurement I need to know is the distance between the edge of my saw plate and the edge of the saw blade. In my case, that's 5 inches. So I want to make sure this edge is more than 5 inches from this edge. Now I can attach this with whatever. I'm using pin nails at first just to hold it in place, and then I'll go back and countersink some holes and lock it down with screws. And it really doesn't matter if this strip is perfectly straight, just as long as this is the straight edge. Then I need to clamp my jig down to something, and in this case that's going to be my workbench, and I'm going to run my saw across the jig, keeping firm, steady pressure on the plate so that it doesn't lose contact with the straight edge. Now I have a perfect zero clearance edge that's parallel to the straight edge. And a quick tip here is make sure you have the right kind of blade in your saw. When you get a circ saw, it's most likely going to come with a general construction blade, which is just going to leave a dirtier cut and possibly more tear out. You want to get a higher tooth count blade that's meant for cross-cutting or cutting sheet goods, and it's going to do much better. And having this be zero clearance is going to make your cuts very clean because it will back up the cut. Remember that the blade rotates like this when it's cutting, so chip out and blowout is most likely to happen on the top side of your material. Here's what that cut edge looks like using the jig, and here's what it looks like using just the saw with no jig. You want to make sure the motor of the saw has plenty of clearance from the clamping area, so measure the distance between the edge of the saw plate and the end of the motor and make that the width of the guide rail. So in summary, a good way to determine how wide to make this jig is by adding the distance from the edge of the saw plate to the edge of the blade, plus about 1/2 inch of waste material, plus the distance from the edge of the saw plate to the end of the motor, plus 1.5 inches. Okay, so you can stop right here and this jig would be ready to go. But one thing I like about my track saw is that I can attach a rail square to it so I can get nice square cuts. To solve for that, I'm going to cut a small strip of plywood. I would make this at least 12 inches to get a nice long reference surface. I'm going to screw one end of it down to the bottom of my jig, keeping clear of the cutting side. Then using a square, I'm going to reference the cutting edge of the jig to make sure that I'm dead square with that edge, and then screw the other side in place. Now I can make square cuts to the edge of the plywood that I'm cutting. Alright, so this is a pretty good substitute for a track saw, and it only cost me a few bucks and a few minutes to make. Dust collection, on the other hand, that's a different story. If you're just setting up a new shop, you might question whether or not you should start by getting a miter saw even before investing in a table saw. I think that's a bad move. In fact, I could argue you don't need that miter saw at all if you just build this next jig, which will give you like 90% of the capability. A crosscut sled is a great jig to make for your table saw because it allows you to make safe, repeatable, and accurate cuts. There's a lot of super fancy sled designs out there, and this is one jig that you can really go wild on and trick out as much as you want, but a good basic sled will let you do 3 things. Make perfectly square 90-degree cuts, make repeatable cuts of the same length, and mitigate the risk of serious injuries like kickbacks or accidentally cutting yourself. I decided for this video not to go step by step through doing this build because there's like 11 billion videos on YouTube about it already, including the one that I did, which I'll link down below. But fair warning, if you watch it, it's pretty awful. I mean, unless you have trouble going to sleep at night. It's great for that. Instead, I think what I'm going to do is give you my best tips for building one of these sleds so you can learn from my experience and apply it to building your own. And the first tip is give a lot of thought to how big you want to make your sled. In my opinion, this size sled is about as big as I'd ever want to go, and truth be told, it's too big for like 90% of the cuts that I make on it anyways. I think I can go up to 27 inches wide, and honestly, if I'm doing something that big, I'm using a different method altogether, like my track saw, or the new circ saw jig that I just showed you how to build. And one thing to keep in mind to even make a cut that big, I've got to pull my sled way out here. And at this point, I'm barely making contact with the miter slots, and you can see all the wiggle that I'm getting. So it would be really difficult to keep this thing perfectly square in order to make an accurate cut. And another thing is this jig is pretty heavy, and that may become a factor in whether you decide to go pull it off the wall to use it or just make a quicker and potentially more dangerous cut. This sled, on the other hand, runs on only one side of the blade. It doesn't have the other half of the sled or the back fence, which already makes it much lighter. Depending on what I'm cutting with it, I may need to support my workpiece on the other side of the blade, and in those cases, I just throw down a scrap of ply onto the table saw to catch my piece. The other nice thing that I like about this style is it allows you to make a pivoting fence. I can cut any angle I want, not just 90 degrees like the other sled. I used a piece of aluminum extrusion to make this fence, but you can do the exact same thing with a wooden fence. Heck, I even added a piece of wood out here on the end of it, which could come in contact with the blade to fully back up my cuts. And this little sled is specialized to cut 45-degree miters by tilting the blade. So if you want to add miter corners to your projects, this is a great way to accurately cut those. If I'm cutting small parts like trim pieces, then I'm much more likely to grab this sled than I am to use the super huge sled. The next tip I have is to skip wooden runners and hit the easy button by going with an adjustable miter bar. I realize this kind of flies in the face of the DIY spirit. I mean, there's no better feeling than grabbing some scrap wood, sneaking up on that cut, and dialing in the absolute piston fit on your miter slot. Yeah, a piston fit now until the conditions in your shop change. One day it's hot and humid, and a little while later it's cold and dry, and wooden runners are going to expand and contract accordingly. Even a tiny change in the width of the runner can make it bind, causing you to use an unsafe amount of force to push it through, or wiggle, causing you to make inaccurate cuts. Manufactured miter bars are going to be made of aluminum or steel, so they're going to be a lot more durable, and they're going to come with adjustment points so you can dial in the fit exactly to your table saw's miter slot. And another tip is to make it as easy as possible to recalibrate the fence. With enough use, every table saw sled is going to go out of 90, and it can be a real headache to get that fence realigned. Because the fence is attached with screws from underneath, if the fence ever goes out of square, you pretty much have to start over with a new set of screw holes, which you can only do so many times before you just have to scrap the whole sled. On this sled, I added a positive stop behind the fence using this little bracket, and there's a threaded hole in there so I can use a screw to micro adjust the angle of the fence to dial it into square and then lock the fence down, meaning I can recalibrate this in just a couple minutes. And my last tip is have some way of using a stop block. One of the best features of a miter saw station is being able to make repeatable cuts of the same length very quickly, but you can do the same thing with a sled. You can go super Cadillac here and use a top mount fence with flip stops, or low tech and just clamp a block right to the fence. I like using just a simple T-track and a homemade stop block, or better yet, make the whole fence aluminum and then you have multiple attachment points for different types of stop blocks. Well, so far we've been able to avoid getting a track saw and a miter saw, so let's see what else we can do. The next jig I have for you is more than just a jig, it's more like a jig platform, and that's an auxiliary fence for your table saw. This is probably the #1 way to add the most capability possible to your table saw. Hey, if you don't have a full-size cabinet saw, that's okay. You can adapt these ideas to fit your own table saw. As long as it has a sturdy functioning rip fence, that's all that matters. The core of this jig is made up of 2 identical vertical pieces screwed to a horizontal piece made of 2 strips of ply. The key here is that the horizontal piece needs to be the exact width of your table saw fence. There's also a front and back piece glued into place, and the front piece has a notch cut out, and that's just going to be custom to your saw, just to make room for the locking lever of the fence. If you measure the horizontal piece accurately, once you screw the sides on, you should have a snug piston fit onto the rip fence. And before I assembled it, I added these 4 T-nuts here, which are going to allow me to bolt on the first jig, which is the Mega Fence, a nearly 12-inch high fence made of 2 pieces of ply. I added a layer of Formica to mine just for durability, but that's optional. The Mega Fence has a T-track embedded on one side, a notch cut out on the bottom of the other side, and a special miter track on top, which I'll get to in a minute. First, I want to show you just how sturdy this thing is. I could probably push this whole saw across the shop if I wanted to, and this thing's not going to budge. The most basic use for this fence is to make vertical cuts at the table saw. It's great for cutting things like raised panel doors without the need of a router table or expensive set of bits. I can also use it like this and add some feather boards to the T-track so I can make nice safe cuts, or flip the fence around and use this small notch. The notch gives you the ability to make flush trim cuts. The blade's going to sit right under the notch and flush with the side. Where this is super useful is, let's say that I'm making some cabinet parts and I want to have hardwood edge banding across the front. I can glue the edge banding on, and when the glue dries, I can just place my part against this really tall fence and be fully supported through the cut. And because the blade is flush with this face, any material that passes under the notch is going to be cut clean off, and you end up with a perfectly flush trim. Okay, but what about that top rail? Well, I wanted to have a way to use jigs that need to move across the blade. A good example is this vertical support jig. If you need to make a cut on the end of a tall, narrow piece of wood, this gives you full support and keeps the piece perfectly vertical. This is a great way to make things like tenons for frame and panel doors. The way this works is I created this sliding mechanism out of 2 pieces of scrap wood, and before I glued those together, I embedded T-nuts in them so that I can bolt anything to it. And on the bottom, I added the mating piece of this aluminum rail system. It just slides in and locks into the miter rail, and now I have a secure and easy way to glide across the top of the fence. Another jig I created is this simple spline jig. If you've ever made things like picture frames or anything with a mitered edge, this is a great way to make a cut to insert a decorative spline and give that joint some strength. I even added some tool storage up here on top for some of my most used items to be close at hand. And to keep tools from falling off the fence, I even added some magnets embedded into strips of wood. You may have more or less room up here on top depending on how wide your rip fence is, but just make the best use of the space and keep the most used items right up here. And you can make this entire fence and all the jigs just using your table saw and a drill. And there is one more jig that I made for this, but I saved it for last because it's the next on my must-have list. So if you don't have a joiner yet, but you need to make a clean straight edge on a board, or you need to make a long taper cut, you should make an L fence. All this is 2 strips of plywood put together in the shape of...
That's the letter O.
I couldn't find the right clip, but you get it right. The one I made, I cut slots in it so that I could attach it to my Mega Fence with T-track, but you could easily just clamp this right to your table saw's rip fence. The concept of the L fence is pretty much the same as that flush cut notch that I made in my tall Mega Fence, but with a lot more capacity. You just line it up flush with the edge of the table saw blade and then raise the blade up so that it almost touches the bottom. The next thing you need is some kind of straight edge. You could use a straight edge, or I like to just use a strip of wood, a yardstick, whatever. Mark the starting and ending points of your line and then fasten your straight edge to the workpiece right along that line. I like to use 2-sided tape for this, but you could also use hot glue, screws, brad nails, or CA glue. You want the L fence set high enough that the workpiece you're cutting fits completely underneath it, but the straight edge makes solid contact with the edge of the L fence. Now just make the cut keeping the straight edge in contact with the L fence, and everything on the waist side of the line will be cut flush by the blade. And if you pair it with a planer sled, you can completely eliminate the need for a joiner. If your board has twist or bow, set it on the sled and look for any gaps. If there's any rocking, just shim that up until there's no movement and fasten everything with hot glue so it doesn't slide around. This is the simplest jig in this whole video. Just use any sheet good sized to the width of whatever planer you have and then add a cleat to the front. This will turn your planer into a joiner and allows you to completely flatten one face. Then just pop the board off the jig and run the other side through to make it match. Okay, back to the L fence. This works just the same for taper cuts as well, and the nice thing about an L fence compared to say a tapering jig is that you can cut material up to the full height of your table saw's capacity because there's no sled sitting underneath the workpiece. Did you know you could do pattern routing without a router? If you have an odd-shaped item like this giant ring segment that you need to maybe duplicate a few dozen times, the L-fence is a great option for that too. Just stick your template onto the workpiece and easily cut off all the waste, making a perfect duplicate. And did you know this method could also be used to cut curves? The same rules apply here as if you were going to use a flush trim bit on a router. You need to apply your template and then cut off any waste using something like a jigsaw or a bandsaw and get within a 1/16 of an inch of the template. Now you can just run this across the L-fence, making sure to keep the template in contact with the fence right at the apex of the blade. And now I have a nice smooth curve, and it probably goes without saying, but this only works on outside curves. If you have a concave curve, that's a different technique and a different video. And even though this isn't the most practical way to cut miters, you can do that too. And you can even offset the L-fence and then use it to make rabbiting cuts. You could definitely do this just using your table saw's rib fence, but then you risk the little waste piece of material being trapped between the fence and the blade and throwing it back at you like a spear. So how many jigs do you know of that can make that many different cuts? It's safe to say in woodworking there's a lot of tools that can help you make perfect straight lines, but eventually you're going to want to make something round. I actually did a video all about the different ways you can cut perfect circles, and while each one has its own pros and cons, the easiest and cheapest way to do it is with a router and trammel, and a trammel can be made with just a strip of plywood. Start off by cutting a strip of 1/4 inch ply. Baltic birch ply is really nice here because it's pretty rigid, but whatever you have will work. On one end, I use my router's base plate to mark out the position of the router, and on the other end, I mark out a smaller circle just using a can. Then I can draw 2 lines from the edge of the big circle to the edge of the little circle. To cut out this shape, just use a bandsaw or a jigsaw and make sure to stay about a 1/16 of an inch away from your layout lines. And then I headed over to a sander to clean up those edges all the way back to those lines. Next, I grab the base plate again and then mark out the center hole and the screw placements. And I drilled out the center hole using a Forstner bit and then drilled the screw holes, making sure that I countersunk them so that the heads of the screws are going to sit below the surface. And after carefully laying out my pivot hole positions, I drilled them out. I made mine with 1/2 inch spacing so that each hole represents 1 inch increments in the diameter of the circle that I want to cut. And that's it. Just fasten the trammel to your router and it's time to cut some circles. I mean, these jigs are so easy to bang out that I went ahead and made one for my full-size router as well as a smaller one for my palm router. The big one will cut up to 48-inch circles and the smaller one will do up to 30 inches. And I even added some markings to each hole so that I could tell what that pivot hole represented in terms of the diameter. And the distance between here and here is based on using a 1/2 inch bit. And on the smaller one, it's based off using a 1/4 inch bit because that's all fit in my palm router. So to use the jig, you're going to need to find the center of your workpiece and then drill a small 1/4 inch hole there because using this jig requires a pivot pin like a dowel or these steel pins. Goes without saying, but you want to do this on the underside of your workpiece where the hole's not going to be seen in the end. And begin plunging and cutting. You can cut all the way through if your router bit allows it, but for bigger workpieces, you can use a jigsaw to cut off the waste and then flush everything up the end with a flush trim bit on your router. And there you go, one perfect circle. And that's all the jiggy fun for now. Bye-bye.